back to Hearsay, everybody. I am Jacob Stucken.
And I'm Greg Radisik.
And we are going to be talking today about the upcoming Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act that the Supreme Court of Canada will be hearing later on in March.
The Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act, otherwise known as the GGPPA, is the federal government's piece of legislation that's targeting carbon pollution and kind of both in the public sphere as well as in the industrial realm. It applies to all of our provinces here in Canada, and it's here essentially to reduce the emissions within these provinces. Probably the overall goal is to kind of set a standard, a bottom line that all provinces have to adhere to, and all of the provinces have the ability to implement their own legislation that meets these standards or even exceeds these standards. But if they choose not to, then kind of this is the backstop. This is what's implemented by the federal government.
Exactly. And now we're going to head into our interview with two professors from the U of C. We're going to be talking more about this reference case. So we'd like to welcome Professors David Wright and Martin Olshinsky from the University of Calgary Faculty of Law. Welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Good to be here.
So just briefly off the top, I'm curious if you'd be able to explain your career path and how you ended up at your role at the U of C Faculty of Law.
Well, I'll keep this short and sweet. In short, this was the line of work that I wanted to do basically ever since law school, but the path became a meandering one for a number of reasons, including family reasons. So I spent a fair amount of time in practice and then eventually made it back to do graduate studies in the U.S. And marvelously, this opportunity came up just as I was wrapping that up, and the rest is a short 2-year history.
Yeah, similar. I probably went to law school even with the idea that I would want to practice in environmental law. My mentor there, professor, sort of got me hooked, I think, on academics, but another mentor suggested that I'd probably benefit from some practical experience, so I worked in the federal government for about a half dozen years in environmental natural resources law and policy, and then similarly got my master's degree at a school just up the hill from where Dave got his, and then landed at the university about 6 years ago.
Excellent. That's a very good introduction, and I think that sort of brings us to our next question, narrowing in on the overall topic today.
Yeah, so second question would be, what is a constitutional reference case? That's what this is all about. And why do these cases exist?
Sure, I'll take that one, although feel free to jump in, Professor Olshinsky. So a constitutional reference case is an opportunity for a jurisdiction to pose a certain legal question to the court. So generally, this is another instance of kind of cryptic legal language. So reference case just means a question referred to the court to answer. They're fairly uncommon. Every now and then they crop up, and typically that happens, to answer your why question, Gregory, in situations where there is some degree of legal uncertainty. And so it is important to note, though, that these are non-binding opinions from the court. So to contrast that from a typical judicial decision, which are binding in whatever jurisdiction they're issued, and if it's the Supreme Court of Canada, it's binding on the entire network of legal systems across the country. But in this context, it's an opinion issued by the court to provide legal clarity to actors across the country. Generally, they are observed and followed, though, by all actors and levels of court.
Amazing.
So when we're talking about a constitutional reference case, we often hear about interveners who have a mandated amount of time to speak in these cases, but they have to be granted leave to intervene. To that point, what are interveners in the context of constitutional reference, and what role do they play?
Right, and I guess it makes sense for me to answer this question because I'll be representing one of the interveners before the Supreme Court in the greenhouse gas pricing reference coming up at the end of this month. And so, in any given dispute, of course, you have the applicant, whoever is challenging the constitutionality of the law in this context, and then you'll have respondents. And so here in this context, both the province of Saskatchewan and the provinces of Ontario challenge the constitutionality of the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act, or GGPPA. Canada is the respondent defending its law. But our system recognizes that, beyond those two parties, there may be several other parties that have relevant expertise and interest in the outcome of the dispute, and that they can help the court better understand the issues. They can provide additional context that maybe the primary parties aren't really in a situation to do. And so in this case, so intervention has a long history. It might be unprecedented. I think we have something like 25 interveners before the Supreme Court coming up here in 2 weeks. And so the idea again there, though, is that each intervener, the idea isn't to repeat what the other parties are arguing, but really to try to provide a unique perspective, something that the court might not otherwise get a chance to think about to help it with its analysis.
So outside of these interveners, it seems like there's a lot of opinion throughout the public sphere about the reference and the impact it can have. In your opinions, what impact can this reference case actually have on the public?
Just picking up on Dave's point, that these are not necessarily binding, and yet they clearly have a normative force. And so you think about previous examples, the succession reference. We think about the gay marriage reference in the late 1990s, early 2000s. It seems clear that when the court pronounces on these matters, the public pays attention, and it can help push both acceptance or non-acceptance of a given proposal, for instance, right? So I think it's safe to say that, depending on which way the court lands, is going to have an impact on, I think, how the public perceives this problem, recognizing that at the end of the day, at its core, this is very much also a political dispute between the provinces and the federal government. It will speak to, I think, and have an effect on how the public sees that dispute playing out.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that the disputes you see in public discourse and in the political sphere to some degree flow from uncertainty in the law. So whether people know it or not, the points of debate can be traced back to uncertainty about provincial jurisdiction over natural resources, or at least the degree to which that may be quote unquote exclusive or not, and similar on the federal side of things. So this reference case should put some of those legal questions, or at least important dimensions of those legal questions, to bed, which hopefully will quiet some of the debate and tension that exists out there, at least diffuse it so that the discussions are based on more clarity in the law. So people are talking past each other less and with each other more.
Right. And on that point of clarity, we've had decisions now from the Ontario Court of Appeal, the Saskatchewan Court of Appeal, and the Alberta Court of Appeal on this Pricing Act reference. And if you two could just speak to a moment about maybe some of the differences or similarities in each of those decisions, and sort of how that happens, because these reference cases are nationwide now, but they didn't start out that way.
So there are three reference cases proceeding through the system: Ontario, Saskatchewan, and Quebec. And back to the first substantive question about reference cases. Typically, these do start at the Court of Appeal level in each province, which they have in these three situations. And in the Ontario and Saskatchewan context, both of those decisions were appealed to the Supreme Court of Canada. Supreme Court of Canada said, yep, we will hear these cases, and that's what's happening at the end of March. Alberta is lagging a little bit, just by the by, because the provincial election was late last spring, so the timing of that case moving through court is slightly slower than the other two. Just to break down the anatomy of the decisions in Ontario and Saskatchewan, in short, both were split decisions. The majority in both cases upheld the federal legislation using, under the Peace, Order, and Good Government provision of the Constitution, which is a federal power using the, quote, national concern branch. We don't need to go into the doctrinal rabbit hole here, but it boils down to how the pith and substance, also more colloquially put as the purpose of the statute, boils down to what the purpose of the statute is. In both cases, the majority framed that quite narrowly. And so this new federal power is relatively targeted and specific, whereas the dissent viewed it as a more general matter. So the majority found that the purpose was to set a minimum national pricing standard or similar. Martin, you can parse that a bit more. Whereas the dissent typically looked at this as regulation of greenhouse gas emissions in general. Alberta Court of Appeal was sort of the opposite in terms of the split decision, where the majority looked at this as a very general matter, an undue intrusion or imbalancing of federal-provincial jurisdiction constitutionally, whereas at least one member of the dissent in Alberta did uphold it using a fairly narrow framing.
So one of the things I think that might be useful for your listeners to understand is that it's not really a question of whether or not the federal government can take action to deal with climate change. All the parties actually acknowledge, and all the courts have acknowledged, that there are powers here. Criminal law has been used to protect the environment. There's what we might call a more straightforward or conventional use of the federal taxation power. So the question really in this context isn't rather if, but how. And so what Canada has argued in the context of the GGPPA, which is 250 pages of legislation, is that it said, look, we are actually going to invoke this residual power. So it's not one of what we call the enumerated heads in Section 91 or 92, but rather we're invoking this residual power. And under over 100 years of case law, there's essentially these two branches. One is called the emergency power branch, and so that the federal government can do whatever it needs to do to deal with an emergency. And in fact, stay tuned. I think when we talk about coronavirus these days, you might see the federal government doing something pretty drastic in that context to deal with it on a national level. But then even in the absence of an emergency, there's what's called the national concern branch, as Dave was mentioning. And so Canada said, look, we think that this is a matter of national concern and we want to deal with it. The flip side of that is that you get this fairly plenary power, supports broad regulatory kind of regimes. And Canada says, this is what we need. We want to be nimble in this context. So then the provinces are turning around and saying, no, this isn't a matter of national concern. This is too broad. And if you use this power this way, you're going to essentially wipe us out. The impacts on our own policies and preferences are essentially cast them aside. And so as Dave mentioned, one of the ways around that for the majorities in Saskatchewan and Ontario was to define the matter very narrowly. They said this isn't about the regulation of GHGs generally. It's about setting minimum national standards, whether for pricing or otherwise, for reducing emissions. The dissents in both those courts disagreed with that characterization, thought it was maybe too cute by half, sort of said, look, let's be realistic here, folks. What you're doing here is you're regulating all emissions, essentially. And that is really what the Alberta Court of Appeal sort of then exactly takes that outcome and flips it. And the majority there says this is about GHG regulations. This is fundamentally about natural resource development in the province. Therefore, the federal government had no authority to pass it.
And just to pick up on that natural resources element, would it be fair to say that was another distinction in Alberta, was the more dispositive weight that was placed upon Western Canada and Section 92A, which we don't need to get into in great detail, but that aspect versus, say, maybe Ontario and the non-Western allocation of natural resources?
So absolutely, there's a arguably unprecedented discussion of Section 92A in the Alberta Court of Appeals majority decision, which is very Alberta-centric in terms of its conception of those provisions around natural resources. Of course, what natural resource development looks like in Alberta is very different from what it looks like in British Columbia or what it might look like in Ontario or Saskatchewan for that matter. So absolutely, that's a big part of it for sure.
And I would just jump in and say that the view taken by the majority in the Alberta Court of Appeal opinion is fairly rigid in its interpretation of provincial jurisdiction over natural resources. And this is a long, contentious issue, and so there's a spectrum of ideas and a spectrum of interpretations and opinions in court cases on it, though not a lot of court cases. But the majority's view is I wouldn't say patently inconsistent with other lines of cases, but does take a much more rigid view than the last few decades of jurisprudence on the division of powers and cooperative federalism in Canada. So it'll be useful for the Supreme Court of Canada to discuss that in relation to its own jurisprudence over the last few decades.
So we know that at the end of March, the Supreme Court of Canada will be hearing the appeals from the Ontario Court of Appeal and the Saskatchewan Court of Appeal. However, the Alberta Court of Appeal decision won't be appealed up to the Supreme Court. It will just be considered by the Supreme Court when it hears from the interveners and the parties in the other two cases. So what does that kind of create for the constitutional situation going forward?
So what's interesting actually about that question is that Alberta won its reference, right? So it actually can't appeal to the Supreme Court. And so only Canada could appeal. And I think most of us understand that what's probably going to happen simply is that, Saskatchewan and Ontario are set down for March 24th and 25th.
Yes.
And, I think we all expect that Canada will essentially accept the outcome of that reference in any case. And it's unlikely to further appeal the Alberta decision itself. But as part of that then is, and this might explain, and also, think of the speed with which the Alberta Court of Appeal decision came out, right? The hearing was in December, and we have a decision by late February. It will be part of the background, I think, understanding that the courts will be applying in this context. And I think we all assume, for instance, that the Attorney General for Alberta will be borrowing from the Alberta Court of Appeal's judgment in his own arguments before the court.
Exactly. Just to build on that, so the Attorney General of Alberta will be in the courtroom as an intervener, able to make submissions for Alberta. Further, just like any other court case, the Supreme Court will have relevant recent decisions and jurisprudence before them, including the Alberta Court of Appeal case. So Alberta will be very much present and even actually represented, just not as a party.
It's good to have that understanding, because depending on your interest level and your experience with the news coverage of these reference cases, it's not always easy to determine who's participating, why they're participating, and what are the roles of the different governments, because that's an overarching theme that we're discussing today, is that the federal government has one view and then the provincial governments have a range, I might add, a range of different views. Because in these cases, we have the province saying, we deserve to regulate, but then they need to have their own scheme of rules, of statute, to regulate.
Yeah, there's a number of ways to approach that question, but to build on Martin's earlier point, this isn't a question of whether the provinces or the federal government have jurisdiction to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. It's a matter of how. All provinces have some regime in place. But let's just step back to an important point about the architecture of this federal legislation, which is it's a backstop. So similar to how you define the matter and the purpose, it really is designed to create a floor, right? So that all provinces and territories have to at least meet this minimum, recognizing that climate change and greenhouse gas emission reductions are a collective action problem. This is a way to get the collective to act at least to a certain degree, presumably in line with international commitments, or at least some kind of meaningful action. And so Alberta specifically, they had a system in place called the Carbon Competitiveness Incentive Regulation. That was repealed and replaced by the new provincial government late last year, but it took effect starting at the start of this year by the Technology Innovation and Emissions Reduction Regulation. And so this gets complicated in a hurry, but I'll try to be very plain language about it. So under the federal regime, there's Part 1 and Part 2 that are most relevant. Part 1 is the so-called carbon tax, carbon levy, part of the regime that imposes a price on carbon somewhere along the emissions stream or chain, and that is typically passed on to the consumer, for example, at the pump. There's also part 2, which is the so-called output-based performance regulation or something to that effect, and that covers large industrial emitters. And so that's in place. And so what happens is in the federal legislative regime, there is lots of space. There's lots of legislative space for provinces to do their own thing as long as it meets that floor. And so when a regime like the new Alberta one comes along, there's sort of a crosswalk or comparison between the provincial regime and parts 1 and parts 2 of the Act to see if it meets that minimum standard. In the Alberta context, Part 2's the industrial level, let's call it, industrial level regime, passes muster, and it's deemed equivalent. And so that part of the new Alberta regime is in place and functioning kind of harmoniously with the federal regime. The first part, though, the carbon pricing that gets passed on to consumer is not in place in Alberta anymore, and so the federal backstop is therefore being imposed on the Alberta context.
In particular, why do you think it's so controversial between the federal and the provincial government of Alberta in terms of the implementation of this carbon tax? Because you'd think that Alberta might come up with a solution that meets the muster, because they were definitely capable when it came to the industrial regulations.
Yeah. I don't want to make too much conjecture around the political side of things, but in general, I mean, you saw that carbon pricing has, for many years now, if not decades, been a contentious political issue. Elections have been fought, won, and lost on it. It's a fairly easy target to raise in an election context, and a promise to eliminate some kind of fee, levy, tax that costs people money every day, even if it's just cents, is attractive. And I think we've seen across the country, a lot of election campaigns want to make hay out of that and garner votes.
Zooming out a bit, in terms of the general aspect of the environment and greenhouse gas regulation, one of the things that we might be hearing about in this reference case is the idea of emissions leakage. Would you be able to speak to that, both maybe interprovincially but also globally, and why that can be played both ways depending on your view of this act?
It's one of the reasons that Canada has asserted the jurisdiction to do this under POG, under the National Concern Branch, is exactly that problem. Is that while recognizing that the provinces have various heads of power through which they can access emissions reductions, property and civil rights, Section 92A, jurisdiction over resources, the flip side of that is that they're confined to those things within the province, and that another province that doesn't take action, for instance, can undermine or effectively wipe out any kind of gains that other province has made. So the example, of course, and why British Columbia, for instance, is intervening in favor of Canada's jurisdiction is that British Columbia has made significant strides, has had a carbon price in place for 15 years almost, I think, has won elections on it. There's a sort of a bipartisan consensus in British Columbia. And yet, if Alberta doesn't do its part, if Saskatchewan doesn't do its part, then a lot of that good work can be undermined. Further, to speak to this idea of leakage, rather than reducing emissions in British Columbia, what might happen is that a company could just pick up and move its shingle over to Alberta, for instance, where it says, well, we have less costs incurred here. So that's really, that's part of what the rationale for this minimal national standards sort of regime, right, is that it ensures that that no one province is undermining the efforts of the other, and that they're all sort of rowing in the same direction. It is true that can also happen on an international context. But in that context, of course, nation states have tools and levers that they're able to exercise to sort of deal with it. So one of them is border adjustments. And we haven't seen a lot of that right now. So imposing a tax, for instance, or a levy on goods that are coming in that don't have in their location of origin, don't have a similar sort of pricing mechanism, then you impose those at the border and you've essentially negated that sort of competitive advantage. There's also, of course, international law, the international legal order, the IPCC framework. So nation states are able to bind each other in these kinds of international agreements in ways that the provinces are not able to do, actually. And in fact, if, in the sort of worst case scenario, of course, states do have the power, theoretically at least, and sometimes we've seen this exercised, to sue for transboundary harm. That's something that can happen sometimes. And again, provinces don't have that kind of power. So, all of that sort of pushes in the direction that, really this has become a national problem and is something that Canada needs to be able to deal with.
Right. Getting back to the national concern idea as well, maybe more of an abstract conception, but still you have this argument by the federal government and by BC saying that a failure of one of these provinces to meet that backstop is a problem that Canada has to deal with and indeed is dealing with through these global instruments. We had the Paris Conference, for example, and then those elements have to get distilled down to the provinces.
Yeah, and I mean that's the cryptic language around that in the test is the provincial inability test. And so to the extent that any single province or subset of provinces are unable to set some kind of floor, some kind of backstop for everyone to act, the legal argument goes that then that should be provided to the federal government as constitutional power, but to be exercised with restraint in the spirit of cooperative federalism.
Right. This idea that we have a bit of a tension between the two branches. We have the provincial and the federal lists of responsibilities, and sometimes they overlap.
Yeah, for sure. And what's interesting actually here is that this is actually one of the main issues I think that we're going to see the Supreme Court having to grapple with is the nature of this provincial inability test. And so the provinces that are opposed, Saskatchewan and Ontario, have argued that it's not about their refusal, but rather it has to be a genuine inability, some kind of jurisdictional impediment that prevents them. And they say, the fact of the backstop mechanism, the fact that the Act stands down in the face of valid provincial legislation that meets the comparable stringency, they say is proof that there's no inability here, but rather a refusal, and that's a policy disagreement and not a constitutional or a legal one. The reverse side of that is essentially just the history of the national concern branch, and the provincial inability test and the way it's been developed over time is that it actually does seem to consider the potential for not just not a pure inability, but a refusal to do something and the effect that would have on extra provincial interests. And so one way to think about it is actually in terms of externalities. The question here is, is this something that we say is fully within provincial jurisdiction, within the sphere of jurisdiction that the provinces ought to have some degree of autonomy to control, and this invokes notions about federalism and the nature of our federation? Or, in fact, is the nature of the problem such that they are externalizing some of these impacts, in which case it makes sense for the federal government to have a role in sort of cleaning that up or closing that gap?
So essentially the implications of the coming reference and the coming Supreme Court decision would be just solidifying the jurisprudence going forward surrounding greenhouse gases and kind of seeing what's the next jumping board from where we are now to where we might be in the future.
Yeah, so two quick legal points, and I'll volley the second one over to Martin in a moment. But first of all, I don't think we were all that clear earlier in saying that there is not much case law with respect to the so-called POG power under the Constitution. There's just a small handful of cases. So maybe full circle in our discussion, these reference cases are coming up and proceeding because there is so little guidance from the court. And so to, I guess, us legal geeks, this is going to be a very valuable moment where we get clarity. But we should be clear that we've only been talking about this one so-called residual federal constitutional power of POG. And there are actually a number of other powers that the federal government can use to legislate in relation to greenhouse gases and has in the past. And perhaps, Martin, you want to jump in to describe at least some of those.
It's possible. Certainly certain interveners have argued alternative heads, and so they've argued the emergency branch, actually. None of the lower courts have taken that on, but the argument has been made. They've argued the criminal law power, and so the criminal law power has been used fairly extensively in Canada since about 1997, when the Canadian Environmental Protection Act regime for toxic substances was upheld as a matter of criminal law.
The point is that the power is there, that we're just talking about one specific one. And so we'll see how this goes, but this won't put the issue of regulation of greenhouse gas emissions to bed forever. The federal government will be around and doing stuff in this space for a long time.